The lunch that was supposed to be ordinary for federal Judge Nia Whitmore ended the moment a white sheriff walked into the restaurant and demanded she stand up for disturbing the peace. Nobody in that dining room knew that the black woman sitting quietly by the window held the authority to preside over the largest federal cases in the state. Sheriff Wade Harlan did not wait for an explanation. He cuffed her right there, in front of strangers holding forks midair, in front of a waiter frozen with a tray of untouched plates. Nia said nothing dramatic. She only looked at him and asked if he was certain he wanted to do this. Wade laughed at the question. Less than 10 minutes later, the phone in his own office would ring, and the voice on the other end would say only one sentence: "Release her immediately." Nia Whitmore was 41 years old, a federal judge known less for her presence than for her precision. She was calm in a way that unsettled people who expected loudness from power, sharp in a way that made lawyers rewrite their arguments the night before appearing in her courtroom. She never wore her position like a costume. There was no entourage trailing her, no clerk carrying her bag, no announcement of her name before she entered a room. That afternoon she wore a plain gray suit, nothing that signaled rank, and she sat alone at a small table near the window with a folder of case notes spread in front of her. Working through a ruling she had been turning over in her mind since the morning session had ended. She liked this restaurant because nobody there cared who she was. That was, until Wade Harlan decided otherwise. Before any of that, in the ordinary rhythm of the morning, the restaurant had been filling slowly with its usual lunch crowd, the smell of coffee and warm bread drifting from the kitchen, a low murmur of conversation settling over the room like a comfortable blanket. Nia had chosen the table by the window on purpose, the way she often did, because it let her watch the street while she worked, and because nobody there ever asked her questions about her job the way people did the moment they learned her title. For an hour, at least, she had simply been another woman having lunch, and that anonymity was worth more to her than most people would have guessed. Wade Harlan was 48, the sheriff of the county, a man whose reputation preceded him the way thunder precedes rain. People said he liked being seen more than he liked being right. He believed the badge on his chest was not just a symbol of duty but a kind of permission, a signal that told him who deserved respect and who did not, and over the years nobody had really challenged that belief, because most people simply complied the moment he raised his voice. He had grown used to rooms going quiet when he walked in. He had grown used to being obeyed before he even finished a sentence. He had built his entire career on that particular kind of certainty, rising from deputy to sheriff faster than most of his peers, largely because he never hesitated, never second-guessed a call, never let a room think he might be wrong. People mistook that for strength for a long time. It had taken years for anyone to start noticing that it was something closer to carelessness wearing a uniform, and even those who noticed rarely said so out loud, because Wade had a way of making disagreement feel like disrespect, and few people in the department wanted to test how far that feeling might carry him. His deputies had learned, over time, to let him take the calls he wanted, the ones that promised an easy display of authority, while they quietly absorbed the more complicated cases that required patience rather than presence. It was an arrangement that suited everyone until it did not. Until the afternoon, a routine complaint about a customer turned into something none of them could quietly absorb on his behalf. That afternoon, a call came through, dispatch claiming a female customer was refusing to cooperate with restaurant staff, and Wade did not ask for details before he decided the situation belonged to him personally rather than to any of his deputies. He liked calls like this one. They were simple, resolved quickly, the kind of thing that let him remind a room exactly who was in charge without much effort at all. He grabbed his hat off the hook by his office door and told dispatch he would handle it himself, the way he always did with anything that promised an easy show of authority. The truth was smaller and quieter than the call suggested. Nia had noticed an error on her bill, a charge that did not match what she had ordered, and she had simply asked the server to double-check it before she paid. There had been no raised voice, no argument, nothing that resembled a disturbance of any kind. But Wade did not ask the server what actually happened. He did not ask Nia what she had said. He walked straight to her table, looked down at her, and told her to stand up. Nia set her pen down slowly and asked him for what reason. Wade's jaw tightened, the way it did whenever someone answered him with a question instead of compliance, and something in his expression shifted from routine irritation into something closer to contempt. A few people nearby had already lifted their phones, filming quietly, the way people do when they sense something is about to go wrong and want proof of it later. An older man at the counter set down his coffee cup without drinking from it. A mother at a corner booth pulled her son a little closer, watching the exchange over his shoulder. The restaurant, which moments earlier had been full of the ordinary noise of forks against plates and low conversation, went thin and careful, the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. Wade did not seem to notice any of it, or if he did, it did not slow him down. Nia did not resist. She did not raise her voice or reach for anything in her bag. She kept both hands visible on the table, folded one over the other, the posture of someone who had spent years telling other people exactly how to behave in front of an officer and now found herself demonstrating it in front of one instead. She only asked him once more, evenly, whether he was certain he understood exactly who he was arresting. There was no threat in the question, no edge of superiority, only the flat clarity of someone offering a final chance to reconsider. Wade smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes from a man who has never once doubted his own authority, and he gave the order to cuff her. As the metal closed around her wrists, Nia looked directly at him and told him to remember exactly what he had just done, because she intended to remember it too, down to the second. Wade walked her out through the front of the restaurant, while the room murmured behind them, and somewhere near the door, a stranger said quietly that the woman did not seem to have done anything at all. Wade answered without turning around, saying that he knew exactly what he was doing. Nia did not argue with him on the sidewalk. Instead, she asked, calmly and clearly, for the reason behind the arrest, the legal basis for it, the names and badge numbers of the officers present, and whether the dashboard camera in his patrol vehicle was currently recording. Each question landed like a small stone dropped into still water, and Wade's irritation grew with every ripple because he was used to silence, not documentation. He accused her of trying to intimidate him with legal language, and Nia answered simply that she was not trying to intimidate him at all. She said she was only remembering. That single word sat strangely in the air between them, and something about the stillness in her voice made even the officer standing beside Wade glance over at her twice. Wade pressed further, telling her that most people in her position knew better than to speak to him like that, and Nia only tilted her head slightly, as though his remark answered a question she had not asked out loud. She never once mentioned her title. She never said the word judge. This was the detail that would later make everyone who watched the footage lean forward, wondering why a woman being wrongfully arrested showed no fear, no anger, no desperation, only the quiet patience of someone who had already seen how this story would end. The walk from the restaurant door to the patrol car felt longer than it should have. A young couple on the sidewalk stopped to stare, and one of them raised a phone as well. Catching the moment, Wade opened the rear door and guided Nia inside with a hand on her shoulder that was firmer than it needed to be. Nia lowered herself into the seat without complaint, the folder of case notes left behind on the table, still open to the page she had been reading before any of this began. Somewhere behind her, the waiter stood frozen near the register, unsure whether to apologize to her or to explain himself to Wade, uncertain which of them actually deserved the explanation. At the station, a young officer named Mara Ellison took the intake paperwork, and something about the calm in Nia's eyes did not sit right with her from the very first glance. She asked Wade whether they had verified the woman's identity yet. Wade told her it was not necessary. Mara looked toward Nia, half expecting some kind of protest, but instead Nia only told her that she should verify it anyway. Wade, annoyed at being questioned twice within the hour, ordered Nia moved into a holding room, and as the heavy door swung shut behind her, Nia glanced at her watch and murmured to herself that they would be calling within minutes. Inside the holding room, Nia sat with her hands folded, showing nothing that resembled panic. She did not cry. She did not pound on the door or demand release. She asked for a pen and a sheet of paper, and when Mara brought them to her, Nia began writing with the steady hand of someone documenting a case rather than surviving one. She wrote down the exact time of the arrest, the location, the names of the officers involved, the patrol vehicle's plate number, the names of witnesses who had been present, whether cameras were active, and the precise words Wade had used. Mara watched her through the small window in the door, and doubt began to spread through her chest like cold water. Wade came in a few minutes later, trying to reassert control the way he always did, asking Nia whether she thought she was somehow special. Nia answered simply that she did not. He pressed further, asking why she seemed so unbothered despite being locked in a room. And Nia looked up at him with an expression that held no anger at all, only certainty, and told him it was because she already knew how this would end. Wade laughed the way a man laughs when he has not yet understood the situation he is standing inside of, and he walked out still believing he held every advantage in the room. He returned once more before the hour was over, this time with less patience in his voice, telling her that cooperation would go a long way if she wanted this handled quickly. Nia set her pen down and looked at him without blinking, asking whether cooperation meant answering his questions honestly, because she had already done exactly that from the moment he approached her table. Wade did not have an answer for that. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, as though waiting for her to flinch, and when she did not, he left again, the door closing with a little more force than before. Nia went back to her list without looking up, adding one more line beneath the others, a small note about the tone of his second visit, the exact words he had used, the exact time on the clock above the door. Meanwhile, Mara had gone to her desk and typed Nia's full name into the county system, but the results came back incomplete, blocked by clearance restrictions belonging to a federal database she did not have access to. She tried again, adjusting the spelling, thinking perhaps she had mistyped something, but the same restricted notice appeared a second time, a small red flag, beside a name that should have returned an ordinary record, if this were truly an ordinary arrest. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach, and she picked up her phone and called a friend who worked in the county legal office, someone who might recognize the name faster than any database could confirm it. The line went silent the moment she said Nia Whitmore aloud, and her friend's voice came back low and urgent, warning her not to touch that file. Mara asked why, confused, and the voice on the other end asked whether she meant Judge Whitmore. Mara felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. Her friend went on, quickly and quietly, explaining that Nia Whitmore had presided over 3 of the largest federal cases the district had seen in a decade, that attorneys spoke of her courtroom, the way soldiers spoke of a particularly disciplined commanding officer, and that whatever had happened tonight needed to be undone before anyone with real authority found out how it had been handled. Mara thanked her friend and set the phone down with a hand that was not entirely steady. She turned to look back toward the holding room, where Nia sat, reading a folded newspaper someone had left on the table, as composed as if she were waiting for a delayed flight rather than sitting inside a county jail. It was that composure, more than anything her friend had said on the phone, that convinced Mara she had stumbled into something far larger than a simple mistake. A woman who had truly been arrested for nothing did not sit that still. She either raged against the injustice of it or crumbled under the weight of it. Nia did neither. She simply waited, the way a person waits for water to boil, certain of the outcome and unbothered by the time it took to arrive. Mara ran down the hallway to Wade's office and told him they needed to stop everything immediately. Wade, still convinced he was in control, reminded her that he was the sheriff, as if the title alone settled the matter. Mara told him plainly that the woman he was holding was federal Judge Nia Whitmore. Wade let out a short laugh, assuming this was some kind of exaggeration meant to rattle him, and he continued laughing right up until the phone on his desk began to ring. He picked it up, expecting a routine call. Instead, a voice on the other end, flat and precise, identified itself as calling from the office of the clerk of the federal court, and Wade's expression slowly emptied of its earlier confidence. The caller asked him to confirm Nia Whitmore's current location, to confirm her physical condition, and to have county counsel present immediately. Wade asked, almost involuntarily, how serious this actually was, and the answer came back without hesitation. The sheriff was currently holding a sitting federal judge in custody. There was a weight to the sentence that seemed to fill the entire office, and Wade found himself gripping the edge of his desk, as though the floor beneath him had tilted slightly out of true. Even then, some part of Wade refused to fully accept fault. He asked whether he had the authority to arrest someone who had broken the law, and the caller confirmed that he did, before adding, after a brief pause, that he did not have the authority to ignore the procedures he had just bypassed entirely. The caller went on, listing them almost gently, the way a teacher lists a student's mistakes rather than a prosecutor lists a defendant's crimes. No identification had been requested before the arrest. No verification had been attempted, despite an officer specifically raising the question, and the written report filed afterward did not match what the restaurant's own cameras would later show. Wade said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would not sound like an excuse. Outside the station window, a black sedan pulled to the curb, and a group of federal attorneys stepped out onto the pavement, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this exact walk many times before. Wade watched them through the glass, and for the first time that day, the certainty drained completely from his face. Mara stood a few feet behind him, silent, watching the same scene, and thinking that whatever happened next would not be something either of them could undo by apologizing. To understand why Nia Whitmore never once raised her voice through any of it, it helped to know who she had been before she became a judge. She had spent years as a public defender long before she ever wore the robe, representing people who had no money for private counsel and no understanding of the systems working against them. She had watched, case after case, how differently people were treated depending on whether they knew the law or feared it, how a badge or a title could tilt a room before a single fact was even presented. She still remembered one case in particular, early in her career, a young man named Terrence, who had been stopped for a broken taillight and ended up spending 3 nights in a cell because an officer decided his nervousness looked like guilt. Nia had fought for 2 weeks to get the charges dropped, and by the time it was over, Terrence had already lost his job for missing shifts he could not explain from behind bars. Nothing about the case had been fair, and nothing about winning it had made the damage disappear. It was a lesson she carried with her long after she stopped practicing law from that side of the courtroom. That vindication, however satisfying, rarely undid the harm that came before it, and that the goal was never simply to win, but to make sure the system itself worked the way it claimed to. That experience had shaped the principle she carried into every courtroom she ever sat in, the one she repeated quietly to new clerks on their first day. That power proves nothing about whether a person is right, and that only the way a person chooses to use that power reveals the truth of who they are. She had said it to law students. She had said it in speeches she never enjoyed giving. And now, sitting inside a county holding room with a folded newspaper in her lap, she was living inside the exact principle she had spent 20 years teaching to other people. Back at the station, Federal Attorney Julian Cross arrived without raised voices or threats of any kind, his presence quiet but absolute, the way certain people carry authority without needing to announce it. He asked simply who had given the order to arrest Judge Whitmore, and every eye in the room turned toward Wade. Wade admitted it was him. Julian nodded once, almost gently, and said that was good, because now they knew exactly where to begin. When Nia was finally brought out of the holding room, she did not immediately demand Wade's arrest or humiliation. Instead, she asked to see the incident report first. Julian looked slightly surprised at the restraint in her request, but Nia told him plainly that she did not want special treatment. She wanted the truth laid out on paper, the same as anyone else would receive. That decision was what separated Nia from someone who simply won because of rank. As she read through the report Wade had filed, her eyes moved slowly across the page, and somewhere near the middle, her expression shifted, not into anger, but into the focused stillness of someone who had just found the thread that would unravel everything. The report claimed that Nia had exhibited disorderly conduct, had refused to provide identification, had resisted the officers, and had behaved in a threatening manner toward Wade and his staff. Every line was a careful distortion, written to justify what had already happened rather than to describe what actually had. Nia read each sentence twice, her expression unreadable, and when she finally looked up at Julian, she told him this was no longer simply a case of poor judgment. A poor judgment could be explained away. A written record built entirely out of things that never happened could not. But the restaurant's security footage told an entirely different story. It showed Nia remaining seated calmly, answering every question asked of her, never once raising her voice or her hands, never once threatening anyone in the room. The camera angle even captured the exact moment Wade's hand tightened on her shoulder as he guided her toward the door, a detail his report had conveniently omitted. A restaurant employee named Alara Boone came forward without being asked twice, saying she had recorded the entire incident on her phone the moment she sensed something was wrong, because something about the way Wade had approached the table had struck her as excessive from the very beginning. Alara handed her phone over without hesitation, saying she had been waiting all afternoon for someone official to ask her about it. She explained that she had worked at the restaurant for nearly 4 years and had seen plenty of difficult customers in that time, enough to recognize the difference between someone causing a scene and someone simply asking a reasonable question about a bill. What she had witnessed that afternoon, she said, had never once looked like the first thing, no matter how the official report tried to describe it. When Julian asked whether she was prepared to say all of that formally, on the record, Alara did not hesitate before agreeing. Julian Cross had worked federal cases for nearly 2 decades, long enough to develop a quiet patience of his own, one that matched Nia's almost exactly, which was perhaps why the two of them worked so well together in the hours that followed. He set up a small office in a spare room at the station, laying the restaurant footage, the station's internal recordings, and Wade's written report side by side across a single table, treating the investigation the way a surgeon treats an operation, methodical and unhurried, refusing to let anger dictate the pace. He reviewed the footage carefully, and one moment stood out sharply from the rest. In the recording, Wade could be heard asking Nia whether she thought she could speak to him that way. His voice edged with irritation rather than authority, and Nia's response was measured and plain, that she was only asking for a reason. It was a small exchange, but it captured everything the written report had tried to erase. Julian played it 3 times before he finally leaned back in his chair and said quietly that this was the kind of evidence that made a case simple, not because the facts were complicated, but because the contradiction between the report and the footage was so plain that no lawyer, however skilled, could talk their way around it. Mara, working alongside Julian now rather than beside Wade, discovered that the station's internal cameras had also captured the entire interrogation room conversation, which meant Wade would have no room left to reshape the story in his own favor a second time. She brought the footage to Julian quietly, without telling anyone else in the department first, aware that doing so was the only way to keep it from disappearing, the way certain inconvenient recordings sometimes did in departments more interested in protecting their own than in protecting the truth. But buried inside that same footage was something none of them had expected. Moments before Wade gave the order to arrest Nia at the restaurant, his phone had rung, and the call had come from a name that meant nothing to Mara, but meant a great deal to Nia the instant she saw it written down. The number belonged to a man named Corbin Voss, a local businessman with deep ties to several elected officials across the county, a man whose name did not belong anywhere near a routine call about a disruptive customer. Nia stared at that name for a long moment before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice carried none of the surprise the others in the room expected. She said quietly that this had not been a coincidence at all. Corbin Voss owned one of the largest construction firms in the region, and Nia had, some months earlier, signed a ruling connected directly to his company, a ruling that had opened a massive investigation into a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a development meant to reshape an entire stretch of riverfront property using contracts that skirted the edges of federal oversight. Corbin had tried, in the months that followed, to pressure her privately through indirect channels, sending intermediaries with vague offers dressed up as courtesy, hoping to soften the outcome before it became public. Every attempt had failed against her refusal to bend, and each failure had, apparently, only sharpened his determination rather than ending it. What none of them yet understood was how deeply Wade had actually been involved, or whether he had simply been a tool someone else had picked up and used without his full knowledge. Julian raised the question carefully during a private conversation with Nia later that evening, asking whether she believed Wade had known exactly who she was when he gave the order. Nia considered it for a long moment before answering that she doubted it. Men like Wade did not usually plan things that carefully. They simply reacted, loudly and without hesitation, to whatever authority handed them. And that instinct, more than any grand conspiracy, was often the easiest thing in the world for someone like Corbin to exploit. As it turned out, Wade had not known the entire plan. All he had received was a brief call describing a woman causing trouble at a restaurant, along with an instruction to handle her personally and quickly. To Wade, it had sounded like nothing more than an ordinary favor, the kind of call he received often enough from people with influence in the county. He had no idea that Corbin knew precisely who Nia Whitmore was, or precisely what she represented to his company's future. Nia, for her part, did not rush toward accusations. She asked instead who could have known she would be eating at that particular restaurant that particular afternoon. Julian checked the court's internal scheduling records and found that almost nobody outside a small circle had access to that information, and one name inside that circle belonged to a court administrative employee named Dorian Pike. Nia understood immediately that her schedule may have been leaked from somewhere close, yet she still did not know who had actually betrayed her, and she refused to let anyone move too quickly. She told Julian plainly not to arrest anyone yet. When he asked why, she explained that moving too soon would only warn whoever stood behind all of this that their operation had already been uncovered, giving them time to hide the parts that mattered most. Before she left the station that evening, she turned back toward Wade one final time and told him that he believed today he had arrested her, when in fact, without meaning to, he had opened the very door that would let her investigate the people standing behind him. In the days that followed, a special hearing was convened, drawing together federal prosecutors, county counsel, an internal affairs investigator, and a representative from the federal court itself. The room where it took place was smaller than a courtroom, plainer too, with fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead, and a long table where every chair seemed to carry more weight than an ordinary piece of furniture should. The investigator opened the hearing by reading the timeline aloud, sentence by sentence, from the moment dispatch received the call to the moment the federal attorneys arrived at the station. Hearing it laid out in that flat, procedural voice made the sequence sound even worse than it had felt living through it, each decision stacking on top of the last until the whole thing read like a checklist of everything a law enforcement officer was trained not to do. Wade Harlan sat at the center of that room, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through the restaurant and the station days earlier, forced now to answer for decisions he had made without pausing to question them. He had traded his uniform for a plain suit that afternoon, and somehow the absence of the badge on his chest made him look smaller than he had ever looked wearing it. Corbin Voss was summoned as well, seated a few chairs away, his expression carefully neutral, practiced in the particular stillness of men, accustomed to never admitting anything on record. He wore his composure, the way other men wore expensive watches, as something meant to be noticed and admired, and he crossed his legs and folded his hands, as though the proceedings were a minor inconvenience rather than a reckoning. It did not take long for Wade to realize how thoroughly he had been used. When questioned about the call he had received before the arrest, Corbin claimed he did not remember placing it at all, his voice smooth and unbothered, as though the accusation belonged to someone else entirely. Wade turned toward him, something raw finally breaking through his composure, and said flatly that Corbin had called him personally. Corbin repeated, almost lazily, that he did not recall. Wade's voice rose slightly then, the first real crack in his self-control since the hearing began, insisting that Corbin knew exactly what he had said on that call, that he had used the word handle, that he had made it sound like nothing more than a routine complaint about a difficult customer. Corbin only shrugged, unbothered, the way a man shrugs when he has already decided the consequences of a lie are smaller than the consequences of the truth. It was Nia who ended the exchange, sliding a printed record of the phone call across the table without raising her voice at all, asking only whether it was his memory that had failed him or the record itself. The paper sat between them for a moment, untouched, and something in Corbin's expression finally shifted, the practiced neutrality thinning just enough to show what was underneath it. The room shifted the moment Mara Ellison stepped forward with a copy of the internal footage she had preserved, before anyone could quietly delete it. She had made the decision, on her own, to testify, knowing it would put her career at odds with the very department she worked inside of, knowing too that some of her colleagues would never quite forgive her for it. Mara had joined the department 3 years earlier because she believed, in the earnest way that young officers often do, that the job was fundamentally about protecting people rather than controlling them, and the days since Wade's arrest of Nia had tested that belief more than anything else in her short career. She had thought, more than once, about staying quiet, about letting the federal investigators reach their own conclusions without her involvement. But every time she considered it, she thought of Nia sitting calmly behind that door, and the thought would not let her rest. Her voice shook slightly at first, then steadied as she spoke, the way a person's voice does when they realize the truth is easier to carry than the silence had been. She told the room plainly that she had asked Sheriff Harlan whether they should verify Judge Whitmore's identity before proceeding, and that he had told her it was not necessary. She added, almost as an afterthought, that she had asked twice, and that both times his answer had been the same, delivered with the same flat certainty he used for everything. The silence that followed her statement was heavier than anything Wade's earlier excuses had managed to produce. Wade did not look at her. He stared instead at a spot on the table, as though trying to find some detail in the wood grain that might explain how a routine afternoon had brought him to this particular chair. Everyone in the room believed the situation had reached its conclusion, that the truth had finally surfaced in full, and justice would simply follow its natural course. But Nia was not finished. She had one more piece of evidence she had been holding quietly, waiting for the right moment to place it on the table, an email sent before she had even arrived at the restaurant that afternoon. The message described, with unsettling accuracy, the exact time she planned to be there, the specific location, and even the reason behind her visit that day. And the sender of that email was not Corbin Voss at all. It was Dorian Pike, the administrative employee from inside the court system, whose name Julian had flagged days earlier. The revelation did not fit neatly into the shape everyone expected. Dorian had not sold Nia's schedule for money, nor had he acted out of any personal grievance against her. He had worked in the court's administrative office for almost 9 years, a quiet man who kept to himself, the kind of employee whose name nobody remembered until something went wrong. Corbin Voss had been holding evidence of a financial mistake Dorian had made months earlier, a mistake serious enough to end his career, and possibly worse. Uncovered somehow through channels Dorian still did not fully understand, and had used that leverage to force his cooperation, framing it, at first, as nothing more than a small favor between acquaintances. When Nia finally sat across from Dorian, in a small room with a single table between them, he broke down before she said more than a few words, his hands trembling as the weight of months of silence finally gave way. He told her he had never wanted any of it, that Corbin had approached him quietly at first, almost kindly, and had only revealed the full threat once Dorian had already given him small pieces of information he could not take back. Nia listened without interrupting. She did not raise her voice or shame him for what he had done. She told him simply that he had been afraid. Dorian admitted, through unsteady breath, that he had not known what else to do, that he had told himself for weeks it was a small thing, a harmless thing, until it clearly was not. Nia answered that he knew now, and something in the way she said it seemed to offer him a way forward rather than only condemnation. He agreed, without hesitation, to testify against Corbin, and for the first time in months, he said, he felt like he could breathe normally again. Wade, sitting through all of this, finally understood the scale of what he had been pulled into. He had been a tool in someone else's design, manipulated into acting quickly without asking questions, but that understanding did nothing to erase what he himself had chosen to do that afternoon. He had failed to verify who he was arresting. He had ignored the procedures meant to protect exactly this kind of situation. He had written a report that did not match the truth. He had used his badge as though it excused him from every ordinary obligation of fairness. Nia stood in front of him one final time before the hearing closed and told him plainly that he was not being investigated because he had arrested her by mistake. She looked at him steadily and said that he was being investigated because he had believed, without ever questioning it, that the badge on his chest gave him permission to do whatever he wanted. In the weeks that followed, Wade Harlan was suspended pending a full formal investigation into his conduct, his years of quiet immunity from consequence finally coming to an end. He would later face a formal review board that examined not only the arrest of Judge Whitmore, but a pattern of similar complaints stretching back years. Complaints that had previously been dismissed or quietly buried by a department too comfortable with his reputation to challenge it. Corbin Voss found himself under a separate and far more serious investigation for interfering with the judicial process, an inquiry that reached into contracts and relationships he had spent years carefully hiding, unraveling connections that stretched well beyond the riverfront project that had started it all. Investigators found that Corbin had used similar pressure on at least 2 other officials in neighboring counties, smaller favors traded quietly over years, each one small enough on its own to seem unremarkable, until they were laid out together and the pattern became impossible to ignore. His attorneys tried, for a while, to frame the entire affair as a misunderstanding between old acquaintances, but the phone records and the testimony from Dorian Pike left very little room for that argument to survive. Dorian Pike, once a frightened accomplice, became a cooperating witness whose testimony helped connect pieces investigators had been chasing for months. And though his own financial mistake still followed him into a separate proceeding, the honesty he offered afterward counted for something in how that proceeding was eventually resolved. Mara Ellison, the young officer who had trusted her instincts over her chain of command, was formally recognized for following procedure and telling the truth, even when it endangered her own position within the department. She would later say, when asked about it, that she had not felt brave in the moment, only certain that something was wrong, and that certainty had simply refused to let her stay quiet. Yet Nia refused to turn any of it into a personal act of revenge. When reporters gathered outside the federal building weeks later, cameras lined up along the steps, and microphones extended toward her before she had even finished descending the last few stairs, one of them asked her directly whether she wanted Sheriff Harlan to pay for the humiliation he had put her through in front of an entire restaurant. Nia paused only briefly before answering, her voice as calm as it had been the day the cuffs first closed around her wrists. She said she did not need him to pay for anything. After a short silence, she added that what she needed was for him to be held accountable, and that those two things were not the same, even though people often confused them. A second reporter asked whether she believed the case revealed something larger about how badges were sometimes used against people who looked like her. Nia considered the question carefully before answering, saying that she would rather the case be remembered for what it revealed about process than about any single person's character, because processes, unlike people, could actually be fixed. The distinction mattered to her more than any headline ever could, and it was the answer that appeared, eventually, in nearly every article written about the case afterward, quoted more often than anything else she said that day. On a quiet afternoon not long after, Nia returned to the same restaurant where everything had begun. The place looked exactly as it had before, the same worn wooden floors, the same soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen, nothing about it hinting at what had unfolded there weeks earlier. She asked to be seated at the same table by the window, and ordered the meal she had never finished the first time. The waiter, recognizing her instantly, asked with careful hesitation whether she truly wanted the same seat as before, his voice carrying the particular awkwardness of someone unsure whether the memory should be mentioned at all. Nia smiled and told him that she did. She sat down, without a security detail trailing behind her, without any entourage announcing who she was, without needing to prove anything to anyone in the room. A few other diners glanced her way, some clearly recognizing her from the footage that had circulated in the weeks since, though none of them approached her table, and she seemed grateful for that small, ordinary privacy. Outside the window, a patrol car passed slowly along the street, and Nia glanced up briefly, before returning her attention to her plate, continuing her meal exactly as she had planned to that first afternoon, unbothered and entirely at peace, as though the intervening weeks had simply folded quietly shut behind her. There are people who believe power lives inside a badge pinned to a chest, and there are people who believe it lives inside the chair a judge sits in behind a courtroom bench. Wade had believed the former for most of his career, certain that the weight of metal on his uniform excused him from the slower, more careful work of actually being right. Corbin had believed something closer to the second, convinced that enough money and enough patience could eventually bend any ruling in his favor. Both of them, in their own way, had been wrong about where power truly lived. Real power has never lived in either of those places. It lives in the choice a person makes when they understand exactly what they are capable of doing and decide, without needing applause or witnesses, to do the right thing anyway. It lives in a young officer choosing to question her superior rather than simply obey him. It lives in a frightened employee finally telling the truth, even after months of silence. It lives in a judge who could have used every ounce of her authority to humiliate the man who humiliated her, and chose instead to ask only for accountability. That was the choice Nia Whitmore had made in the restaurant, in the holding room, in the hearing, and in every quiet moment in between. And it was the choice that mattered far more than the title she carried. In the months that followed, the case would be cited in training sessions for new officers across the state, not as a story about a single sheriff's bad judgment, but as a lesson in what happens when procedure is treated as optional rather than essential. Mara herself was eventually asked to speak to a group of recruits about what she had witnessed, and she found herself repeating, almost without meaning to, the same quiet principle Nia had lived by throughout the entire ordeal, that the badge did not grant permission to skip the steps, meant to protect the very people it was supposed to serve. The recruits listened carefully, the way people listen when a story has already proven itself true. The story ended not with a courtroom eruption or a dramatic sentencing, but with a single image, quiet and deliberate. Nia sat at her desk that evening, closing a case folder and setting it down in front of her. On its cover, printed in plain government type, were the words that would define the months to come: United States of America versus Corbin Voss. She looked at it for a long moment, then turned off her desk lamp, leaving the room in a stillness that felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely her own.